The second time I pricked my finger on the knitting needle, I let myself cry. Not before. Before that I had swallowed it the way I swallowed everything else. Behind my teeth, behind my ribs, behind the dumpsters where the kitchen staff threw out yesterday's bread. 24 weeks along, and hiding it under an apron 2 sizes too large, I sat on an overturned crate in the alley behind Meridian Tower and worked yellow yarn into something that might, someday, be a cap small enough for a head I hadn't met yet. My name is Marlo Hendricks. I was 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, and employed, for now, for maybe another week if Bettina Marsh had her way, as a maid on the residential floors of the tallest building in the city. 4 years ago, I had initials after my name and a corner desk at an accounting firm that trusted me to find the 7 cents that didn't add up in a 9-figure ledger. Now, I trusted myself to find the extra napkins before anyone noticed they were short. Bettina had slapped the tray out of my hands 20 minutes earlier because I'd been too slow setting up the East Conference Room, and slow to Bettina meant showing. "You're 2 months past due already," she'd hissed, close enough that I could smell her coffee breath, using the word like a debt collector reciting a balance. "Past due and still dragging yourself in here every morning like the company owes you something." I hadn't argued. Arguing cost energy I didn't have to spare, and besides, she wasn't wrong about the debt. Griffin had made sure of that. He'd made sure of a great many things before he stopped answering his phone. So I sat behind the trash cans in the cold, and I stitched, because my grandmother used to say that hands doing something small kept a heart from doing something large and stupid, and I hummed the 4 notes she used to hum, and I told the baby, I always talked to the baby back there, where no one could see me being soft, that we were going to be fine. That I would find a way. That whatever happened, nothing thrown away stayed thrown away, not if I had anything to say about it. That was when the service door groaned on its hinge, and warm light spilled into the alley, and every word I had just sobbed into the dark had an audience of one. She stood in the doorway in a charcoal coat, with her phone dead in her hand. I would learn later that the elevator bank had eaten her signal, and she'd stepped out for 1 bar of reception and found me instead, tall in the particular way that made rooms go quiet before she said a word. I knew her face from the elevator posters, from the annual report on the lobby table, from the way every staff member on every floor lowered their voice when her name came up. Delphine Ashworth Cade. The papers called her the widow of Meridian Tower, and they said it with the same reverent fear people used for weather that could kill you. I scrambled up too fast. The crate tipped. The half-finished cap fell into a puddle, and I went down on one knee to save yellow yarn from grease water before I thought to save my job. "Don't," she said, not sharp. Quiet enough that I almost missed it under my own pulse. I froze there, crouched, wet wool in my fist, waiting for the rest of the sentence. "Don't let me see you here again. Don't bother coming back tomorrow." And it never came. She crossed the alley in 4 strides and crouched down across from me on the filthy concrete in a coat that probably cost more than my mother's house, and she looked at the cap in my hand like it was evidence in a case she was building. "How far along?" she said. It wasn't a question so much as an audit. 24 weeks. I heard my own voice shake and hated it. "And you're out here in the cold, on your knees, past your shift, because..." She stopped. Something crossed her face, there and gone, the kind of flinch a person only shows when a wound gets touched by accident. "Because someone told you to hide it." I didn't answer that. I didn't have to. She already knew. Up close she smelled like juniper and storm-struck slate, cold and clean, and somehow alive under the cold, the way the air smells right before it snaps into winter. It should have frightened me. Instead, something in my chest, Something that had been clenched since the day Griffin stopped picking up, loosened by one single notch, the way a knot gives before it fully lets go. "Get up," she said, and offered her hand. "You're done back here." I thought done meant fired. I said so, plainly, because if I was going to lose the job, I wanted to lose it with my dignity intact and not grovel first. She looked almost amused by that, the corner of her mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile. "Done back here," she repeated, "not done working." "There's a difference, Miss Hendricks, and I'd have thought an accountant would appreciate it." That stopped me cold in the alley, cap dripping in my hand. "How did your file?" She said it like it explained everything, which, from a woman who apparently read the personnel files of 200 maintenance staff, it did. Devon and Marsh, 4 years, senior associate. "You resigned, rather suddenly, the same month a Hendricks account discrepancy of $11,000 was quietly written off as clerical error." Her eyes hadn't left mine. I don't think it was clerical error. I felt my face go hot despite the cold. I never proved anything. I saw the numbers weren't reconciling, and by the time I said something, I was the one who looked guilty of moving them. "Someone made you look guilty," she said, and there was iron under the quiet now. Iron I hadn't heard from her yet. "That's a different sentence than the one you just told yourself." Bettina found us then, hurrying across the loading dock with her cardigan flapping, already talking before she'd fully arrived. Something about a mix-up, about how Marlowe wasn't usually back here, about how it wouldn't happen again. Delphine let her get exactly 4 sentences in. "Miss Marsh." 2 words. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop another 5 degrees, though no wind had moved. "Miss Hendricks is being reassigned to the residence wing, effective tonight. You'll process the transfer before you leave." Bettina's mouth opened and closed like a hooked fish. "Miss Ashworth Cade. If I'd known she was, that is. If there's a concern about her performance, there's a concern," Delphine said, "about a pregnant employee working a double shift in December cold behind a dumpster because she was afraid to be seen resting. I'd like you to sit with that concern overnight, Miss Marsh, and have an answer for me tomorrow about how it happened on your floor." She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. Bettina went the color of old paper and left without another word, and I stood there in the alley with a soaked knitting project and a job I no longer understood, and Delphine looked at me the way you look at a column of numbers that almost balances. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold, and you're carrying for 2. I followed her through the service door into gold light and warm air, and behind me the trash cans and the crate and the cold sat empty, and something in the pit of my stomach, old, wary, 4 years bruised, wondered exactly what it was going to cost me to be seen like this. The residence wing occupied the top 11 floors of Meridian Tower, and I had cleaned exactly none of them before that night, because staff like me stayed below floor 40 by unspoken policy. The elevator climbed through 30 floors of glass and quiet money, while my reflection in the mirrored wall tried to look like it belonged there. It didn't. Neither did I. They gave me a room of my own on the staff level, small, but with a window, a real bed, a door that locked from the inside, 3 things I hadn't had together in longer than I wanted to count. Nora Fitch, who ran the private kitchens and had apparently worked for the Ashworth Cade family for 22 years, met me at the door with a plate of food I hadn't asked for and a look that assessed me from shoes to belly in under 2 seconds. "Eating for 2 and built like a coat hanger," she said, not unkindly, and put the plate in my hands before I could protest. "We'll fix that." She fixed it over the following days, with a stubbornness I came to recognize as love wearing an apron. Prenatal vitamins appeared on my nightstand with no note attached. A pair of compression stockings showed up in my size, in my drawer, the same week my ankles had started swelling badly enough that I'd taken to propping my feet on a folded towel under my desk. When I mentioned once, in passing, to Junie, the only other maid on the staff floor who talked to me like a person instead of a cautionary tale, that I missed my grandmother's honeyed pear cake and hadn't tasted it since she died, I didn't think anything of it. 2 days later, there was pear cake, still warm, on the counter when I came off shift. And Nora wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked who'd requested it. "Kitchen makes what the household wants," was all she'd say, which told me everything and nothing. I saw Delphine rarely, and always briefly, crossing a hallway in the mornings, dictating something clipped and precise into her phone, once catching my elbow without a word when I misjudged a step on the private stair and went momentarily off balance. Her hand was cold, her grip was sure, and the small charged silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took her to confirm I'd found my footing before she let go and kept walking, like touching me had cost her nothing at all. I didn't believe that. Not entirely. Not with the way her jaw had tightened for half a second before she released me. The staff whispered about a locked room on the 40th floor that no one entered, and a portrait removed from the main gallery 2 years back, and a name, Elior, that nobody said above a murmur. I filed it the way I'd once filed anomalies, in a ledger, unexplained, flagged, worth returning to. On the 9th day, I was asked to bring coffee into the executive boardroom during the quarterly audit review, a task normally beneath my new position, but the usual girl was out sick, and I didn't argue. I set the tray down at the foot of the table, and my eyes, trained for 4 years to read numbers upside down across a desk, caught the open ledger in front of the man seated at Delphine's right hand. Griffin Sallow, Director of Logistics Finance, the father of the child I was carrying, and the man who had stopped answering his phone the same week I'd told him I was pregnant. He looked up, and for 1 full second, the numbers on the page in front of him meant nothing at all next to the look on his face. He caught me alone 40 minutes later, in the narrow service corridor between the boardroom and the elevator bank, one hand closing around my arm hard enough to bruise before I'd finished setting down the tray. "What are you doing here?" he said, low, fast, glancing over his shoulder. "In this building." "Working for her." "Living," I said, and pulled my arm free. "You'd know, if you'd stayed around long enough to ask." "You can't say anything." His eyes were doing the math I recognized from 1,000 hours across a desk from men exactly like him, the frantic, sweating math of a person trying to make a bad number disappear before someone else finds it. About the baby. About whose it is. If Ashworth Cade finds out I've got a situation with kitchen staff, I lose the directorship. You understand what that means for both of us. I understand you're worried about the wrong ledger. The words came out of me before I decided to say them, and I watched his face do something ugly and fast. "Careful," he said, soft as a blade going in sideways. "You made accusations before, Marlowe. Nobody believed you then either." He left before I could answer, and I stood in the service corridor with my heart going too hard for a woman 6 months pregnant to be standing still. And I understood 2 things with terrible clarity. The numbers I'd glimpsed on that ledger page weren't clerical error, and Griffin worked 12 feet from Delphine Ashworth Cade's office every single day, with full access to every account in the building, including, I would learn within the week, several that funneled through the household staff's own supply budget. That night, Nora told me, unprompted, over tea I hadn't asked for, why the household had a standing, unbending policy that no pregnant employee worked past 30 weeks without full paid leave, why security escorted any expectant staff member to a car after dark without exception, why the 40th floor stayed locked. 2 years ago, Delphine's wife Elior presented Omega. 7 months along with their first child had gone into a heat-triggered hemorrhage during a business trip Delphine hadn't been able to leave in time to reach. By the time Delphine's plane landed, there had been no one left to protect. She built the policy the week after the funeral, Nora said, staring into her cup. Built half this household around it, if you want the truth. And then you turned up crying behind the bins with a baby of your own, and no one watching your back. And I have never in 22 years seen that woman move as fast as she did that night. I sat with that a long time after Nora left. Somewhere on the 40th floor, behind a locked door, was a nursery no one had ever finished. And somewhere in this building was a man who had gotten me pregnant and was actively stealing from the woman now protecting me, and I did not yet know which threat was going to reach me first. It was the ledger that nearly killed me. In the end, not literally, though it came close enough. I'd started staying up after my shifts in the small staff kitchen, reconstructing what I'd seen on Griffin's page from memory, the way I used to before I lost the taste for numbers entirely. Column by column. It wasn't hard. My mind still worked the way it always had. I had simply stopped trusting it to matter. I was 3 weeks into that quiet, secret work, 29 weeks pregnant, exhausted, running on pear cake and stubbornness, when the dizziness hit me in the 40th floor hallway on a delivery I had no business making alone. The world tilted sideways. I remember reaching for the wall and finding air instead, and then strong hands were under my arms before I hit the floor, and juniper and storm-struck slate flooded the narrow space, and Delphine's voice, close to my ear, sounded for the first time since I'd met her like it had come unlatched. Marlowe, Marlowe, look at me. I hadn't heard her use my given name before. It landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there. She carried me herself to the car, refused Osric's offer to take the wheel, sat in the back seat with my hand crushed in both of hers the entire ride, while a driver ran 3 red lights getting us to the hospital. Braxton Hicks, the doctor said eventually, brought on by stress and dehydration and standing too long on feet that had been swelling for a month. Not labor. Not yet, but close enough to it that Delphine's hands hadn't stopped shaking until an hour after the doctor left the room, and she would not, could not, sit far enough away from the bed to satisfy whatever alarm had gone off in her when I went down. I keep telling myself I'm not going to do this again, she said quietly, to the window rather than to me, somewhere near 2 in the morning, the hospital room dim and close and smelling of antiseptic under her cold, clean scent, and then I find myself standing exactly here anyway. Do what? I asked, though I already knew, though Nora's story sat between us in the dark like a third person in the room. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she reached over, carefully, and closed her hand around mine on the blanket, thumb moving once across my knuckles like she was checking I was solid. Tell me to stop, she said, low, and I will. I didn't tell her to stop. I turned my hand over under hers instead, palm to palm, and let that be the answer. And for a long moment neither of us moved, foreheads nearly touching. Her breath and mine sharing the same small stretch of air. The kiss we didn't quite take yet sitting between us like a held note. There's something else, I said finally, because the ledger had been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks and I couldn't carry it silently anymore, not after this. About the audit. About Griffin. I felt her go very still. Not tonight, I said, before she could ask, before I lost my nerve entirely. Tonight I just want you to stay. She stayed. She didn't ask again. But something in the set of her jaw told me the question hadn't gone anywhere, and neither, now, had she. She told me about Elior 3 nights later in the small sitting room off my quarters, both of us wrapped in blankets against a household staff wouldn't dare set below 74 degrees. She told it plainly, the way you'd read a report you'd memorized against your will, the trip she couldn't cut short, the message that came through 11 hours too late, the nursery on the 40th floor she'd had painted yellow before either of them knew the baby's designation and had never been able to open a door on since. I told myself love was a liability, she said, staring at her own hands. That control was the only thing that had ever kept anyone I valued alive. And then you sat on a crate behind my building talking to a baby about how nothing thrown away stays thrown away, and I have not had a single uncomplicated thought since. I told her mine in turn, not the polished version I gave interviewers, the real one, the firm that fired me quietly rather than investigate a partner's son. The parents who'd stopped calling the month, I told them I was keeping the baby alone. Griffin, whose name I still hadn't said aloud to her, whose ghost sat in the room with us whether I spoke it or not. Marlowe, she said my name like she was setting something down carefully, so it wouldn't break. Whoever it was, whatever he did, I need you to understand that in this house you are not a debt anyone is owed. You are not past due. I hadn't told her that phrase, Bettina's phrase. She'd heard it from staff gossip, apparently, and it had lodged in her the same way it had lodged in me. I don't leave things in the dark where I found them, she said, and it wasn't the first time she'd said some version of that sentence to me, and it wouldn't be the last. I filed it away the way I filed everything that mattered. A promise, tested, would come due eventually. Everything did. That night, in the kitchen, she picked up my half-finished yellow cap where I'd left it drying on the counter and turned it over in her hands with the baffled concentration of a woman used to mastering anything she touched, encountering something her competence had no purchase on. "You're doing it wrong," I told her, laughing for what felt like the first time in months, and showed her the stitch. And watched the most feared woman in the city drop 3 loops in a row and swear under her breath like a furious teenager, and something in my chest that had been clenched shut since Griffin left the room unlatched a second notch, wider than the first. We didn't get to finish the cap that night, 2 floors down, in an office that never should have had access to the household accounts. Griffin Sallow was already moving numbers I'd once been fired for finding, and this time he was moving them into a column with my name on it. They came for me on a Thursday, which felt absurd even as it happened, the kind of ordinary weekday nothing catastrophic is supposed to occur on. Security found discrepancies in the household supply accounts routed through a login registered to my staff badge, a login I had never once used, created the week I was reassigned, buried under enough technical camouflage that only someone who already understood how audits worked would know exactly where to hide it. Griffin's fingerprints were all over the method. His name was nowhere near it. Bettina, still smarting from the alley and eager to be useful to someone, was the one who reported it, loud enough that half the executive floor heard before Delphine did. By the time I was called into the boardroom, the story had already calcified. Pregnant maid, sudden proximity to the CEO, sudden access to funds, a motive as old as money itself. I stood in the doorway of the room where I'd once served coffee, and watched every face at that table decide, in the space of a glance, exactly what kind of woman I was. Delphine sat at the head of the table with her hands folded and her expression sealed shut, the mask I'd only heard about in Nora's stories, the one that had made her the widow of Meridian Tower in the first place. She didn't look at me the way she had in the hospital room. She looked at me the way she looked at a quarterly report with a problem buried somewhere inside it. "Miss Hendricks," she said, and her voice held nothing of Juniper or Storm or the hand that had held mine at 2 a.m, "you'll understand we have to follow procedure." I understood. I understood so completely that something in me simply closed, the way a ledger closes at the end of a bad quarter, the final column drawn and totaled and wrong. They didn't arrest me. They didn't need to. They walked me out through the lobby past every employee who had once feared to look at me too long, past the doorman who'd always smiled and now studied his shoes, out into rain that had started sometime while I wasn't paying attention, with a box of my things and a suspension letter and a baby that chose that exact moment to kick, hard, once, twice, as if she too knew something had gone terribly wrong. I stood on the curb in the rain with nowhere assigned to be for the first time in 3 weeks, and I thought about the alley and the trash cans and how thoroughly, completely, I had let myself believe I would never be standing in a version of that cold again. The worst part wasn't the accusation. The worst part was Delphine's face, sealed shut at the head of that table, giving me nothing to hold on to at all. Junie found me 2 hours later in the 24-hour diner 3 blocks from the tower, soaked through, staring at cooling coffee I hadn't drunk, and she didn't say a single comforting word. She just slid into the booth, put a folder on the table, and said, "You're an idiot if you think I was going to let this go." Inside were photocopies she'd smuggled from the household printer, Griffin's login timestamps, cross-referenced against the security badge logs, cross-referenced against a business trip he'd claimed on the same dates the discrepancies began. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and I had spent 4 years of my life pulling exactly this kind of thread until it unraveled entire fortunes. I worked through the night in that diner booth with a stolen pen and 3 napkins and, eventually, Junie's laptop, rebuilding the real ledger from memory the way I'd started weeks earlier, every anomaly I'd glimpsed on Griffin's page that first day, every figure Nora had unknowingly confirmed over gossip about supply orders, every login timestamp that placed him at his desk while claiming to be in another city entirely. By 4 a.m, I had 11 pages that told a very different story than the one the boardroom believed, and a mind that felt, for the first time in months, entirely and fiercely my own. Osric Bell met us at the service entrance before dawn, gruff, suspicious, the head of security who had never once in 3 weeks warmed to me, and he read those 11 pages standing in the loading dock with his jaw working, and when he finished, he looked up at me with something that wasn't quite an apology. 15 years I've worked for that woman, he said. Never once seen her wait on anyone. She's been standing outside your old room since they walked you out, in case you came back for something. He folded the pages carefully. Come on, let's go give her a reason to stop standing there. Delphine met us in the private elevator, and whatever mask the boardroom had built stayed exactly where it belonged, off her, entirely, the moment she saw me in the doorway, rain-damp and exhausted and holding proof instead of nothing. I never believed it, she said, before I could speak, low and urgent and stripped of every ounce of ice. I had to look like I did for one day to keep him from destroying the evidence before Osric could secure it. I am so sorry it cost you that walk through the lobby. I will spend the rest of my life making sure it was the last one. Griffin was in the building. Of course he was, arrogant enough or desperate enough to believe the frame had held. When security found him at his desk trying to purge a server at 6 a.m, Delphine was the one who reached him first, and it was only my hand closing hard around her wrist, only my voice saying her name once, sharply, that stopped her from doing something to him that no amount of righteous fury would have made forgivable. Let the law take the rest, I told her. I don't want a monster. I want the man arrested. She looked at me for a long moment, breathing hard, juniper and slate gone sharp with old grief and new fury both, and then, slowly, she let go of his collar and stepped back. Call it in, she said to Osric, and her voice was steady again. All of it. The board reconvened 3 days later, and this time Delphine did not sit sealed and silent at the head of the table. She played the recording Osric's forensics team had recovered from Griffin's own purged server, his voice, cold and certain, discussing exactly how easy it had been to route blame onto the pregnant one. No one checks a maid's login. And I watched every face that had looked at me with suspicion in that same room 3 days earlier rearrange itself into something closer to shame. Griffin was arrested in the lobby, in front of the same doorman who had studied their shoes when I was walked out. Bettina Marsh's employment was terminated the same afternoon, not for the ledger. She'd had no part in that. But for a personnel file Osric had quietly compiled over 3 weeks, documenting a pattern of cruelty toward the household's most vulnerable staff that went back years further than me. Past due, she'd called me, and it turned out the household had been carrying a debt of its own where she was concerned, and it came due all at once. Delphine stood in front of the board, in front of the staff who'd gathered in the doorway to watch, in front of me, and said the thing I had not let myself hope she would say in public. Marlo Hendricks found what a team of external auditors missed for 2 years, she said. She did it while carrying a child alone after being failed by this company once already, after being failed by this household a second time under my own roof. I owe her an apology no title will cover. I intend to spend considerably longer than one board meeting making the attempt. She crossed the room in front of everyone and took both my hands, and the whole watching floor went hushed the way rooms go hushed around weather. I don't leave things in the dark where I found them, she said, quiet now, just for me, echoing the promise she'd made weeks ago in a kitchen over a half-finished cap. I should have said the rest of it sooner. I love you. I have loved you since an alley and a scrap of yellow yarn, and I am asking you, now in front of every witness who ever doubted you, will you let me claim you? Bond and all. Only if every part of you says yes. Ask me properly, I said, laughing through something that was very close to tears, and she laughed too, low and startled, like the sound had escaped her before she'd decided to allow it. Marlo Hendricks, she said. Will you be mine? Tell me to stop, and I will. Tell me yes, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I meant it. Yes, I said, and when her mouth found the curve of my neck, and her teeth found the mark that would bond us, gently, deliberately, only after I'd said the word aloud a second time against her ear to be certain, the whole room smelled. Nora told me later, laughing like juniper and warm pear and something neither of us could name, flooding the boardroom floor to ceiling. 6 months later, the 40th floor had a door that opened. We painted it yellow ourselves, badly, both of us, Delphine insisting on perfectly straight lines and getting none of them, and hung a mobile Nora had made from scraps of the pear tree branches out back. And Osric installed a rocking chair by the window without being asked and pretended, when I thanked him, that he'd simply had one lying around. Our daughter was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with her mother's dark hair and, the midwife swore, though I think she only said it to make Delphine cry, which it did, my grandmother's stubborn chin. We named her Wren, for the woman who taught me that hands doing something small kept a heart from doing something large and stupid, and on the morning we brought her home, I finished the cap. It had taken me the better part of a year, on and off, through an alley and a hospital room and a kitchen and a bonding, one yellow stitch at a time, and Delphine sat beside me on the nursery floor in the early light and watched me tie off the last row with the same rapt concentration she'd once given a quarterly report. Griffin was serving 4 years for fraud, the last I heard, and had waived any claim to Wren before the ink dried on the plea. Bettina Marsh, by Nora's gleeful report, was working the counter at a diner 3 towns over and tipped badly and complained constantly and no one there was afraid of her at all. Junie moved up to head housekeeper the following spring and made Osric bring her flowers every time he wanted a favor, which he did, more often than either of them admitted. Delphine took the little yellow cap from my hands and set it with the careful reverence she gave nothing else in this world quite so completely, onto our daughter's head, and Wren blinked up at both of us in the pale morning light through the window we'd painted yellow, and did not cry at all. I had spent so long believing I was something to be sorted, priced, written off as clerical error, and swept out with the rest of the discards. I had been wrong. Nothing thrown away stays thrown away, not if someone is willing to walk out into the cold and look. Some ledgers only balance when somebody finally checks the whole column, all the way down, and finds the one entry everyone else missed, that she was there all along, worth finding, worth keeping, worth every version of home a person can build one yellow stitch at a time. The end.